We are going into week 2 of our Greater Still series, and had a blast of a beginning last week getting to shout out, that Jesus, come on, is greater than the fire, because we all face those, okay, fiery trials, as it were, and that is so much more than a cliche. Some of us, even in this season, are going through some hard things. You got some struggles. That's a part of living in this life, right? And it could be finances, or it could be frustrations in relationship and brokenness. It can be loneliness. It can be some physical things, for sure. Some folks struggling with some of that, need some healing in the house. Sometimes it's just, it is our own battles with self. In fact, we all face and fight that. If anybody's thinking you're the only one that has a sin struggle, you are wrong, right? Come on, we all have something we're fighting and dealing with on this side of eternity, but we have a God that's big enough for the battle. And that's the title of this morning's message as we lean into week 2 in the Greater Still series. And when you consider this concept of greater still, I do love the title. I helped, I guess, to come up with it creatively. But I like that it references that no matter what our current experience. So every week we'll get to shout that out. Like, what is that thing, that is the thing that's too much for us, too much for you, too much for me? There's always something, it feels like it's a little too much, but it's not too much for God. Who don't want to be on the stage shouting that out, to be able to say that, but it's true. Now, I love that concept, and it's a big part of just the biblical narrative. It's the story that we see consistently here is God doing something. Last week, I shouted out a few of the examples. I said, like David was not nearly big enough to face Goliath, but Goliath was not nearly big enough to face God. Come on, somebody. And we did some math in that intro. We talked about Elijah and the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, which became 450 to 1. Terrible odds. We'll discuss that again today. But 850 to 2 is great odds. Or let me say it this way. Let me get the math right. 2 is greater than 850 when one of the 2 is God. All right, so that's where we're at in the series. So if you weren't here last week, I just brought you up to speed with a little bit of simple math. The word greater, which is an adjective, means of an extent, amount, or intensity considerably above the normal or average. I like that, like considerably above the normal or average. And this word still, which is an adverb, simply means or is referring to something that will or may happen in the future. Just because it hasn't happened, one of the words that we love to remind ourselves of around here is yet. Somebody say the word yet. Okay, so it hasn't happened yet. You haven't overcome that yet. So greater still then refers to something that will happen of an extent or amount or intensity considerably above the normal or average, or I would say expectation, like more than we could ever. There's a Bible verse that applies to this, right? Ever think or ask. All right. Greater still. Y'all see if y'all can wake up and help the preacher just a little bit. There you go. There's an anticipation or expectation of hope that God is and will be greater still, and there should be. So the story I want to use to illustrate that today, and this is what Greg is preaching in Southport as well. Certainly his story is his version, but same message. We want to teach today from the life of Gideon. I wonder if anyone predicted that, because every week you're going to be like, what's the story going to be today? And I do love stories from the Bible. And in the story of Gideon, the people of God had been pretty disobedient. They had not followed God's instructions, and he gave them some pretty explicit instructions. Hey, you're going to be living in this land that I've given you, but don't out of fear what's the word I'm looking for? Assimilate? That's not the word I'm looking for. Don't take on the cultures of the broken people you'll be living with. All right. And in that, he understood that a fear of cultural pressure, which is a bit of what we talked about last week, would be part of what might motivate them to acquiesce. And I think that's true for us too. That goes back to what we talked about last week, right? Not going to bow, okay? But he knew that it would be tough for them. And then, though, when they walked in disobedience, the result was devastating. And we'll pick the story up in verse 3 of chapter 6. When Israel planted its crops, Midian and Amalek, the Easterners, would invade them, camp in their fields, and destroy their crops all the way down to Gaza. They left nothing. Check this wording. I think it's incredibly accurate. They left them nothing to live on, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. Bringing their cattle and tents, they came in and took over like an invasion of locusts. And the camels, past counting, they marched in and devastated the country. And when you consider how their lostness left them so broken, and you consider the level to which they were lost and broke, pardon the redundancy there, it's significant. In other words, it wasn't just a little bit. Like they weren't almost okay. Anybody? You ever been to a place in your life when you were way past okay? Like we tried, I'm okay, I'm not okay, right? You ever get there? Like the burden, the heaviness, the weight of it is just, well, here I go again. Too much. And for them, I mean, they had nothing. In fact, the first takeaway for us this morning is this: lostness will leave you working hard with nothing that matters to show for it. Because they were still sowing. They were still working the fields. This plain that they lived in, the plain of Jezreel, a beautiful place. A fertile plain, a fertile place. In fact, it was a site of lots of different battles in history because everybody wanted it. It was a pathway from Babylon to Egypt. And just a beautiful plain about 60 miles north of Jerusalem. And it was capable of producing incredible crop and wealth. But they didn't get to enjoy any of it. Did you ever find a time in your life when you were working hard, you were doing all the stuff, and you might have, even from an earthly perspective, had plenty of money in the bank, and house and cars or whatever, but you were broke or broken? I mean, without God, come on somebody, too much is not enough. They were working hard, but they had nothing to show for it. And verse 6 clarifies that point. The people of Israel were reduced to grinding poverty by Midian, cried out to the Lord for help. In our case, it might be spiritual poverty, but in their case, it wasn't just spiritual poverty. It was physical poverty too. Another takeaway for us is this: when you exclude God from the equation, the outcome will always be less than intended. And I would say also less than needed. Remember the axiom? Some of you who are a little bit old like me, right? Remember that axiom, the hurrier I go, the behinder I get? I mean, they were working and working and working, but they were getting nowhere. And we make that kind of effort too, and when we make that effort without God, it does no good. Synoptic of Judges 6:7 through 10 tells us that in the middle of all of that lostness, they called out to God. They asked for help. They said, Lord, we're desperate for some help here. And they didn't know what to do or how to do it. They didn't know how to get out of the situation that they were in. They had lived uncovered. So when they cried out to God for help, God said to them through a prophet, look, you landed in this situation because of your own disobedience. That was what he said to them, and that's still true for us too. And in fact, another takeaway for us is this: disobedience leads to an uncovered, vulnerable life. It wasn't even just so much that God was punishing them because of the disobedience, though you could make an argument for that under the old covenant for sure. But it wasn't just that. We talk a lot around here about how when we step out from under the authority of God, we step out from under the protection of God. And that's a tough place to live. That's a tough place to be. And that was certainly the case for the people of God in this story of Gideon. God wasn't enough to them, and because of that, no matter what they had, it wasn't enough. But notice the faithfulness of God in this story. That's a beautiful part of the story, an important point for us to remember today, because he answered. When they called, he came. Okay, and he didn't come to condemn. Sure, there was some conviction in there. There was some helpful wisdom that was applied to their broken situation, and God brings that too. If you don't want to hear it, it's going to be tough. Come on, anybody, help me a little bit. That God will speak that correction to us. But then God sends the deliverance, Judges chapter 6 and verse 11. One day the angel of God came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, whose son Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress out of the side of the Midian. So get the scene. If you know the story, this is something that you can probably pull up in a visual. But Gideon is literally trying to take care of the harvest that they had, threshing the wheat in a place where he's hiding, essentially like a cave, like a place where they would thresh the wheat and try to separate the fruit from the wheat from the chaff, as it were. And he's trying to to hide it so it wouldn't be stolen, right? And in that moment, the angel of the Lord comes to him. That's how desperate they were. And then the angel of God appeared to him and said, God is with you, O mighty warrior. Which to him felt ridiculous for God to say. Do you see me over here? Like, I'm mighty warrior. I'm hiding, man. Right now, what's happening is I don't know who you're trying to, huh? That's that. You talking to me? You talking to me? How many times does God come and speak to us about who he can be? Right? Who we're made to be. Maybe not who we presently are, right? At least in our own eyes. And he says, and then this, he said, God is with you, O mighty warrior. Gideon replied, with me, my master. If God is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the miracle wonders our parents and grandparents told us about, telling us, didn't God deliver us from Egypt? The fact is, God has nothing to do with us. He's turned us over to Midian. But then, and I love this, God faced him directly. Right? We talked last week about how God stared down Nebuchadnezzar from the fire, right? Well, in this case, he's looking straight at Gideon. You ever do that with someone I'm talking to you right now, okay? That's how God, he looked him straight in the face. And he said, go in this strength that is yours. Man, and God's infamous for that too. I ain't trying to pick on God today or anything like that. That's not what's happening here. I'm just pointing out some obvious reality in regards to our relationship with God. But we make all these excuses for why we are where we are, and we argue with God about who we can be and how we can be free. And then God rather than even have a discussion with us about it, he just says, well, go in the strength that's yours. Like, okay, I'm sorry, I was just trying to argue you out of this perspective that you could ever change me. And then here you are again. Go in this strength that is yours. Save Israel from Midian. Haven't I just sent you? Gideon said to him, me. He's still struggling. Me? Me, my master? How and with what could I ever save Israel? Go with what I have. I don't have anything. Look at me. My clan's the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least of the lot. And then God said to him, I worked hard to make this point seem desperate because it was and is. Until, here's where the greater gets added to the right side of the equation. You understand what I'm saying? And then God said to him, I'll be with you. Well, there it is. There it is. I said a second ago, like 2 is greater than 850 or 450 or whatever quantity you want to put on that side of the equation. 2 is greater than when one of the two is God. Listen to me. Listen to me. Okay, how are you with Jesus today? I mean, yeah, I get it, okay, I get it. Life is hard and hectic and often heavy, and there's a lot going on, and we have struggles, okay, I get it. But what about God, and how are you in Jesus today? Since I'm up here, I'll just go ahead and preach. What about you and Jesus? Did you ever give God a real shot to make you who he made you to be? Did you follow his instructions and walk in his will so you could access his power and provision? Did you ever do that? Because give that a shot. Let's see who you can be when you grow up then, right? Man, and I appreciate Gideon in this. My family is the least, and I'm the least in my family. Hi, that's me. All right, I'm from Enola, Arkansas. That is alone spelled backwards. It's pretty much what you are in the world if you're from Enola. The running joke there, here it comes again, is that you're never going to run into anyone from Enola outside of Enola except at the Walmart in Conway, which is about 20 miles away. They only have one Walmart, and if you're looking for someone, go to Walmart and wait. They will be there in a minute. All right? And my family was relatively poor, like in our community. Now that I've spent dozens and dozens and dozens of trips and summers over the ocean in southern Africa, I understand the necessity to qualify when I say that we were poor, because it was relative poverty, meaning we were poor compared to the people we lived with, but not to most of the rest of the people on the planet. And I understand that now, and I appreciate that. We're blessed here, everybody. Nonetheless, we didn't have as much as everyone else. And I'm the youngest of 5. All right, my siblings got picked on when I was in elementary school. There was some of that. So there was a lot of identity that I took on as being less than and not enough for whatever it was that God willed for me or whoever God said I could be. But I'm done with that. You understand? I'm not Ron from Enola. I'm a son from the King's house, everybody. That's who I am, and I can be free, and I can be whole, and I can be impactful anywhere on this planet God wants to send me. Well, there you go. Go in the strength that is yours. And whatever you need for who God made you to be, you have it right now. But it'll do you no good without God. It takes God to get God's stuff done. And so I came up with a Ronism years ago that just says this: the God who called you is able to do what the God who called you to do. Sure, you can't pull it off, but He can. Man, I'm not even talking about mission and ministry, though that qualifies. I'm talking about just being who He made you to be, as a son, right? Or a daughter, as a priest and a king, as a husband or a wife or a friend, whatever that is. Someone that's whole and healthy, that doesn't get their butt kicked by life all the time. You can be that. You can stand in there and be who God made you to be. Gideon is unwittingly testifying to what God will teach us through his story when he says this. When he's sitting there making an argument that I'm the least, my family is the least in this area and I'm the least in my family, he's actually making an argument for what God is about to do. Because you may feel like, well, I'm not qualified. Even for, in his case, that he did have a mission to rescue his people, to lead an army. But when we're not qualified, we can still be, come on somebody, qualified. All right, that's not a real word. I understand. Every time you put that in your notes, it will get underlined in red. I want to correct that. Learn it. That's what I said. That's what I said. Learn it, because it's true. Because when God calls you, He qualifies you. That's how that works. And that's what He did in this regard. Then we lean into verses 17 through 29, and Gideon builds an altar to God. That was his next step. He worshiped God for this word and for His provision. He tore down the altars of Baal. So a big part of their sin had been that they were worshiping at a different altar, an idol altar. We do it too. Come on, we got all sorts of idols we're worshiping. Things that are not God but are like God in our lives. Little g gods, you understand what I'm saying? You pick it. You know what it is. If we put the treasure boxes, maybe we would just put them in there and say the Lord could burn them. You know what I'm saying? Because we got them. But in this case, it was Baal. They had built an altar to Baal, and he tore it down. And the people lost their minds. The next morning they got up and they saw the altar to Baal had been destroyed, and they're trying to figure out who it is. And they didn't have street video or anything like that, but somebody told off on him, you know what I'm saying? Because they checked the footage that didn't exist, and they said it was Gideon. Gideon and a couple of his compadres, and so they came for him, and they're like, just take him out. We got to get rid of Gideon. And Gideon's dad, I love what he said, but Joash shouted to the mob that confronted him, and he said, why are you defending Baal? There's a whole nother sermon in that. Okay, why are you defending Baal? Will you argue his case? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If Baal truly is a god, let him defend himself and destroy the one who broke down his altar. And from then on, Gideon was known as Jerub-baal, which means let Baal defend himself, because he broke down Baal's altar. And then the rest of chapter 6, verses 33, pardon so much being summarized this morning. It's a pretty intense and long story. But then, and after that, an entire army joins Gideon. It's a whole army of people. They stood with him at that point. And then Gideon, even then, I love this whole Gideon I can relate to, right? Because even then, even after God gave him protection, he tore down the altar of Baal and all those things, and then an army starts to assemble. Thousands of men are coming to fight alongside him. Even then, he's like, God, are you sure? Are you sure? And it was at that point that Gideon fleeces God, and he says, look, if there's dew only on the fleece but not on the ground, and God was so patient with him. Wait here till I come back. I got things to do. I got to make sure I'm hearing from you. God was incredibly patient with Gideon, and he provided the proof that Gideon asked for. And then in chapter 7, so Jerub-baal, that is Gideon, and his army got up early and went as far as the spring of Herod. So now he's got this incredible army, and he's ready to go fight. This is about 32,000 men. The armies of Midian were camped north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. And the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many warriors with you. Okay, that's a strange thing to say. That's just a strange thing to say. Remember just a minute ago I was telling you that I'm the least in my family. My family's the least, and now I finally got an army, and you're telling me I got too many. There's too much. You have too many warriors with you. If I let you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. So the math, let's do the math real quick. So the math in this story, Judges 8:10 helps us to understand that the Midianites, the Amalekites, they had 135,000 troops. Just for the record, that's how many they had. Gideon had 32,000 troops. Now, I don't know when was the last time you went to war, but 4-to-1 odds, I mean, if you have far superior equipment and training, you might be okay with, right? But generally, 4-to-1 is not the odds you're looking for. Like if you knew, okay, well, this is a size force we have to face, you would try to come up with a similar size force. And you certainly wouldn't think, well, it's too big. This is too many people. I mean, we got to trim this down a little bit because, this isn't fair, or I don't want to feed all these folks. I don't know what we're talking about here. Why the reduction? Why the reduction? I mean, obviously, God explains a portion of it here himself. God didn't want and doesn't want his people to take credit for a victory that we only get because of God, right? That's not good. But I don't think that was the end of it. I really don't. I think that also God didn't want them to win a temporary victory or a victory in a battle. Do you ever have the capacity to win a battle? What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that maybe you could overcome temptation for a day or even a season. You could do better. Anybody do better? If you've ever been in addiction, you understand there are times when you can do better but not be free. I mean, if you've ever tried to be good with your diet and get healthier, you could do better for a season. Come on, somebody. I could do better for a week or two, but man, I mean, that long-term effort is hard to win. It's different. And I don't think that God wanted them to have success and win in this battle but lose the war, to be right back in bondage again in just a quick minute. It needed to be obvious that it was God that gave the victory. And in fact, only God could win the victory. Another takeaway for us is this: we can overcome temptation or difficulty for a moment or a season, but lasting deliverance always comes by the hand of God. And only, you could throw the word only in there. Always and only comes by the hand of God. So he said, therefore, verse 3, tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home. So 22,000 of them went home. That's a lot. That's more than 2/3 by a little bit right there, right? I mean, 22,000. He went to him and he said, whoever's timid or afraid may leave the mountain or go home. Can you imagine being some of the guys who chose to stay? You're like, really? Really? Okay, I mean, we got 32,000 against 130, and you're going home. You're going home. Okay, that's awesome. Well done. Leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. Another point for impact is that fear is a response based on self-assessment rather than faith in God. And these 22,000 dudes didn't have much faith in God. They looked at their situation. They looked at the 4-to-1 and they said, man, we cannot win. This is not possible. There is not enough in us to overcome. That's their thinking. Not going to get it done. And so they left. But can I say to you that if they had stayed, they wouldn't have really fought anyway? I mean, when I read this story, Steve, what I think is that had they drawn up against the enemy, as soon as the battle started, these were the dudes who were in instant retreat. You know, sometimes we live that way too. If we're honest, like we say, okay, this is going to be different. This is a different day. But we're still living in this place of self-assessment rather than faith in God. If we're honest, we're going to overcome. We're going to get it done. It's going to be different this time. Right? But then when the battle starts, we know, right? we're right back where we've been began. And the enemy knows. You know, they say this about bees, they can smell fear on you. You know, well, I would definitely need to wear the gear, everybody. But you know, when a piece of paper has been folded, if ever it's been folded and it's gotten a crease. And I think this is how the fight lives for us sometimes. Like we're okay, it's going to be different this time. But then once we get to that point, it's just easy to fold. It's easy to fold right there again. And how many of us, if we're honest this morning, we've been to this place, we've gotten to a certain level of resistance against the efforts of the enemy to destroy us, or the struggle that we have in our lives, and we kind of get to the same place. A desperation will cause us to make a different decision, but nothing is actually changed at the fold point. That's still where we're going to fold. That's where we're going to run back to where we've been before. And in this story, God's just working that out. He's getting rid of that would fold, right? That would run and operate in fear rather than faith. That's a part of what's happening. And the grand reduction for us, what does that look like in my life? Well, that looks like sometimes God taking away those systems of support that I've created for myself. And I'm not talking about good and godly systems of support, but I'm talking about like I'm going to discomfort you to the degree that you can only trust in me. And when you only trust in me, I'll get rid of that fold point, right? It's like the weld is stronger than the tear in the metal. You understand what I'm saying? Like at that point, when the other systems of support in our lives are gone. Oh, come on, somebody. I know it's a little complicated in its thinking, but you know what it is for you. You know who you call before you call God? What you post before you pray? What you do when you feel tired or alone? Right? What's the setup? And in this case, God he's saying, okay, well, maybe you don't need this extra time. Maybe this is the wrong kind of margin for you. In the case of Gideon's army, he was essentially eradicating the fear response. And then, verse 4, the Lord told Gideon, there are still too many. Man, if you didn't know the story already, that would be funny. There are still too many. We're now sitting at 135 to 10,000. I didn't do the math on that, but that's still the odds are getting worse, shall we say. There are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I will test them to determine. And look at the verbiage in this passage. And this is consistent amongst or across translations. He said, I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. God knew he could find out who will go and who will not. It wasn't even just that I will decide who will or won't go. I will determine. Yeah, sure, I understand this. That again, the verbiage in that is that God was ultimately going to say, don't take them and do take them. But again, I believe it's because God knew what would or wouldn't work when the battle came. When Gideon took his warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, divide the men into two groups. In one group, put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it with their tongues like dogs. And in the other group, put all those who kneel all the way down and drink with their mouths in the stream. Like they're going to go all the way down. And only 300 men actually scooped and drank with their hands. And all the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. And then the Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. I think I'm supposed to do this. Right, that's what I'm supposed to do right there. Okay, God, if I'm Gideon, I'm like, okay. Remember, I mean, it wasn't that long ago we were having this conversation where I so felt like I was not enough for the fight that's in front of me. And then, miraculously, I could not believe it. You brought 32,000 men to fight with me. But you just reduced them to 300. What are we doing right now? Like, how is this supposed to be helpful? You know? And again, I'm working hard this morning to relate this to our own journey with Jesus. Because there are so many times when what we think we need is the opposite of what God wills for us. Because he's got a provision we'll never access if we have an option that is different than him. Man, this greater still stuff requires A willingness to trust God at a level that maybe many of us never have before. Oh, come on, man. It's that if you always do what you've always done, you'll always be what you've always been, or always get what you've always got. Right? You know what I'm saying? Like there's a shift here that has to happen, church family. We got to get to a different place with God and a willingness to follow him that is radical and at times unreasonable. And if we do, we can really be free. And we can really be whole. And on the backside of this, Gideon's going to have everything he could ever need. But it's going to come from God. Talk about this 300 people, though. They were exceptional, too. Because, I mean, come on, y'all. We build a dream team here at 828 Church. We have people who serve faithfully with their hands. You know what I'm saying? Like, if everybody left, who would stay? You know? I mean, come on, that's a heck of a litmus right there. 32,000 left and the 300 are still there. And when he sent them home, they would have been like, dude, you have lost your mind. You most certainly cannot hear from God, and I will not follow you into battle. But those 300 were faithful. They deserve some mad props. And the truth is, a small group of wise, intentional God followers were all God needed. It was all God needed. If you feel like right now, even in your faith life, you got just a few friends that are faithfully following God, hang in there. That's a good group. Come on, if you got a few folk that'll follow God faithfully, that's a game changer. That's a different making friend set right there. I mean, I think God can do a lot with a few folks who are wise and intentional about following God. And that's good. Last week, we literally spoke of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this takeaway, the deliverance of many is often dependent on the faithfulness of few, was a part of that message, and it's true. Whose life will you impact by your choice to be faithful? To stand when everybody else goes home. Welcome to the world we live in right now. Just a little bit, but it don't take a lot. Not when God is a part of the equation. And by the end of verse 7, check it. I mean, by the end of verse 7, I did do the math on this. The earthly odds had shifted from 4-1, not great, but reasonable, to 450 to 1. In the negative here, like it's getting worse, not better, from an earthly perspective. 4-1 to 450 to 1. And here's Gideon, full of faith. Because at that point, the eternal odds were now incalculably in Israel's favor. Because they were most certainly going to win because they were trusting in God. Again, the fight you fight with your flesh, come on. That place of brokenness where you keep trying to do better, give it to God. That place where you seem to be constantly at war with your finances, come on, give it to God. Like lean into God for wisdom and instruction. Follow him and see what God does when you do. Okay, that physical struggle you fight and face, okay, praise God for doctors, and that's important. I think they're a gift from God, but come on, somebody. Let's lean into God and believe God is able, all right? The odds don't matter to God. God doesn't do odds. Odds are not important to God. When God's a part of the equation, the odds are incalculably in your favor. Man, I have worked hard. This is not an easy preach. But there's something in it. We could grab a hold of it. It could change our lives. We could walk in some victory. That'd be nice. Who's tired of losing? About a little bit of winning. Maybe the first goal here would be to let God define what winning is. All right, that's real. But how about a little winning in the house, everybody? Well, And then verse 8, so Gideon collected the provisions and ram's horns of the other warriors and sent them home. But he kept the 300 men with him. And the Midianite camp was in the valley just below Gideon. I described the Jezreel Valley a few minutes ago. This beautiful fertile plain between Mount Gilboa and Mount Tabor, about 63 miles north of Jerusalem, and a place of historical conflict because of how valuable it was. And here's Gideon with his just a small group of 300 up on a hill. Man, it's the original 300, everybody. Up on this hill, looking down here at this 135,000. And then God was so good to Gideon. Hey, can I encourage you this morning? Listen to God a little bit. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. Just listen to God a little bit. Give him a shot here. Lend him your ear and see what he has to say. All right? It makes more sense than you think. And so in this case, Gideon was struggling, even though he was a man of faith. You got to give him some props, because here he stands, ready to go to battle with 300. But he's still fearful, and God felt that. And so God said, hey, and if you're still feeling fearful, go down and listen. There's something that's going to be said that will encourage you. So he goes down and he said, if you're afraid to go by yourself, take a friend. And he did. So Gideon and one of his compadres went down on the edge of the Midianite camp, and they're listening, and they get close enough to hear. I mean, God had to have directed them to the right place to stand, because 135,000 people. But they're standing near one of the commander's camps or tents, and they hear a guy repeat a dream. And he said, I had a dream, and there was this huge barley loaf. It's a weird dream. And it rolled right over our camp and smashed all our tents. And the dude that was listening said, oh man, that can only mean one thing. I'm thinking that can mean a lot of things. Man, God was punking the Midianites, y'all. He was punking them. He said, that can only mean one thing. That means that the God of Israel has given them victory over us. Yeah, that's what I thought. I mean, God is great. God's funny, but he ain't no joke. Yeah. And then Gideon heard that, and he worshiped. He said, God, they believe. They already think they're going to lose, because they are. Right? They were right. Listen, the enemy knows. If we lean into who God is, he doesn't have a chance. Can I encourage you this morning? We're about to wrap this up, but worship before the deliverance. I knew somebody would wave at me right there. Come on, worship before deliverance. Worship before the breakthrough. When is the time to believe for your breakthrough? Right now. Believe in who God is and what God can do. Listen, he's got big plans for you. And he's a redemptive God who can take the worst things that we could ever imagine and cause us to be stronger because of them, and give us hope and help through them and blessings when that's done. And go ahead and worship. Just go ahead and start worship. Worship before the deliverance, the breakthrough, the healing, the victory. CJ is going to join me here. Help me wrap up. Then the Bible tells us in verse 16 that Gideon, I didn't put this on your screen, I'm just going to read it for you. He divided the 300 into three groups, and he gave each man a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. And then he said, keep your eyes on me, and when I come to the edge of the camp, do just as I do. As soon as I and those who are with me blow the ram's horns, blow your horns too, and all the entire camp, around all the entire camp, and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. I love that. For the Lord and for Gideon. And they got to shout loud, everybody. And this, from a military perspective, Jason, this is a terrible strategy. Carry a torch. I don't know where you are. But now they're like, look, here we come. Like, they want them to know I'm coming. I appreciate that too. I want the enemy of my destiny and yours to know I'm coming. Here I come. And I'm not sneaking. I'm coming torch and horn in hand, and I'm about to trust in God, and you better get ready. Then all three groups blew the horns. So they came to the camp. Each in the groups of 100, they blew the ram's horns and broke the clay jars. Then all three groups blew their horns and broke their jars. They held the blazing torches in their hands and the horns in their right hands, and they all shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Each man stood in his position around the camp and watched as the Midianites rushed in panic, shouting as they ran to escape. And when the 300 Israelites blew the ram's horns, they caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other. They drew their own swords against each other, and they were killing each other, and then they just bugged out. Like they ran as as far and as fast as they could go. And Gideon sent word to some of his compadres to come and cut them off at this ford or at the shallow. And by the end of the day, they had routed 120 of the 135,000, which will be taken care of in Judges 8:10. Incidentally. And the last big takeaway for us today is this. Come on, worship team. When little or nothing is surrendered to God, because that's what we have, if we're honest. Like in our own strength, this is what we have, little or nothing. But when little or nothing is surrendered to God, it becomes everything we need to walk in victory. That's pretty much it. What do you have? Well, not much. Or nothing. Well, it's probably more than you think, but it's nothing without God. But if you give it to God, who's greater still? It's more than enough to walk in victory. Gideon and the people in this story, this journey that they were on with God, they were originally lost because of their sin, which was great. Yeah, their sin was great, no question about it. And they were shameful and uncertain about how anything could change because of their sin. And you see that with Gideon, like right from the get-go, he's like, with us, how could you possibly be with us? His identity was all messed up. Look, I'm the least of the least. And their guilt had them completely convinced that they could never be free. That's where they were. But then from there, guilt-ridden and afraid became walking in freedom and victory, because their brokenness at the end of it caused them to trust in the God who could save and heal. A poem, and then I'll get off the stage. Subtracting a negative is actually a positive, while adding God to any equation is always the way to go. Do what you can, and He'll do what you can't. His grace is greater still by far than any challenge, fear, or foe. Too much sin, you say. Too much guilt and shame and hurtful history here, no heart to even fight again. I say not too much for Jesus, the one who died and rose, who loved you to the cross and back, the one who saves and calls you friend. He fights for you in every battle. No one could ever love you more. Greater still, with strength to spare. He's already won the war. Jesus, we sure do love you and appreciate you very much. And I pray, God, wherever we are today, however defeated we feel, hopeless against our own brokenness, I pray today that we would lay that down and believe that you are greater still and by far everything we need. All our hurt and history, any helpless sense of insufficiency, God, we lay that down today and believe that you can make us free, you can make us whole, and not only deliver, but also restore. In Jesus' name.